Okay, welcome back to our second lecture, if you will. Our first real topic. I know the first lecture was the course introduction, so I want to get into the first topic of our semester, which is the historical method. And the reason this is our first topic, and why I'm going to go with this as opposed to quote unquote lecture material, is because this historical method is important. It's going to guide you through the course of your semester project. All of this part is important toward getting from start to finish in your semester project. You're going to be literally doing, as I mentioned in the course introduction, you're going to literally be doing what historians do. So at the end of this semester, you can actually say, even if you have no aspirations beyond this course, you can say that for these 6 weeks, you were a historian. You did the work that historians do. So let's take a little bit of time to look at how that actually works. Okay. Now, let's not pretend that this is a science. I know a lot of times we call this stuff a quote unquote social science. It's not a science, but we do actually have a methodology for what we do. We don't just go out there and go, well, I think I know what it is, and let's just start writing it up or anything like that. There is a process attached to all of this. So first of all, let's get at what the historical method actually is. I think a lot of students are of the opinion, and this is something I told you about in the introductory message. A lot of students are under the impression that all the historical method is simply fact gathering and reporting. And it's a little bit deeper than that. It's not quote unquote just the facts, as I mentioned in the introductory lecture. Since that's in the introductory lecture, I'm not going to belabor the point. Go back and make sure that you watch that introductory lecture if you're not sure what I'm referring to. But there's more to the method, the historical method, than just quote finding out what happened. The historical method is a multi-step process that historians use to investigate and ultimately to write about history. Another way some of us put it is that this is what being a historian is at its heart, what we're going to be looking at here. This is what being a historian is at its heart. So the steps are, okay, preliminary research, creating a hypothesis, gathering evidence, writing a thesis statement, a good solid thesis statement, and then the narrative writing to it. Now, as I say this, I want to caution you on misconceptions. Just because we have a historical method, like the scientific method, don't conflate methodology and infallibility. History is not infallible. A historian can follow these steps, get all the way through to the narrative process and write up what they've done. And another historian could come along and say, read your work and go, well, I don't agree with that, and go through the same methodology, literally look at even the same documents sometimes and say, well, I don't agree with that. I see it a whole different way. And that is okay. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that. So I mentioned these steps. We're going to go through them, through each one of them, so you don't have to worry about remembering all of these as I speak. We're going to talk about each one of these in turn. So right off the bat, preliminary research. This is the first step, the preliminary research step. It's exactly what it sounds like. Preliminary, the preparatory steps in what you'll do. For me, there is only one absolute about this, especially for courses like this one, and that is to pick something that you are interested in as a topic. Now, this sounds like a given. Okay, it absolutely sounds like a given, and it should be a given. It should be that easy, but it isn't always that easy. Sometimes professors assign research topics. When I was in graduate school, there were plenty of research seminars that I took where the professor said, all right, your topic is this for this semester. This is what you're going to be researching and writing about. So it happens. Sometimes in undergraduate classes, it happens where professor is basically going to use their students for basically free research. And they're going to say, well, I want you to look into this. I want you to look into that. For me, I don't like that. I don't like being told what to research because I don't have an investment in it. Okay. I'm not interested in it. To me, that is what's going to guide things. It's going to make it more, it's not only going to make it more interesting, it's going to be something that you're going to want to do. You have a say in all of this, as opposed to just me going, here, just go off and do this. Why would you be interested in doing all of that stuff? So as much as there's a lot of topics out there, I'm going to say this is, to me, the most important one. Find something you want to do. Now, sometimes students start this process and go, you know what? I'm really not as interested in that as I thought it would be. Or they question whether it's a worthy topic. Or sometimes, believe it or not, they sometimes think it's too easy of a topic. I've had plenty of students who have picked topics that were way beyond what they wanted to do. They had literally no interest in doing it, but they thought it would be a very difficult topic, so it would impress me and all that. Don't do that. Pick something you like. Pick a topic you like. And you can do this in a number of ways. Go to the internet. Flip through the textbook, hit the table of contents, hit the index. Make sure that what you choose, it is something that you want to research. Think about that. Think about what you want to do. Think about what you want to write about. And then get to it. Get to the writing about it. If you are interested, for example, if you are interested in the role that women played in Aztec societies, that would be a topic. That's a broad topic. If you're interested in the role that women played in Aztec societies, then trying to understand warrior culture among New Mexico Indians is probably not a good fit, and it's not something you should do. It will produce lousy results. You might even half-ass the research, and it's going to produce bad work. You're going to get discouraged about it, and it won't be good. So pick a topic that interests you. Okay, that's, I think, obvious. Pick a topic that interests you. Then you're going to ask yourself, what do I want to know about this topic? That's how you narrow it down from this very broad thing to something that you can write about in a concise narrative, because for this class, it is a concise narrative. You're not writing a quote unquote big term paper. You're not writing a seminar paper. You're not writing a book chapter or a book. You're writing something very narrow and contained. So you've got to pick your topic, like, what was the role of Aztec women in their society? And then maybe something, you narrow it down. What do I want to know about this topic? Well, what role did they play in birthing rituals? Okay. And how does that have broader applications to Aztec society? So I'm giving you that as an example of topic and then narrowing it down. So ask yourself questions about the topic. What do I want to know about this topic? Now, that's a big part of this. Next, you're going to start looking for evidence about the topic. You're going to look for evidence about what actually happened. What are the rituals? What are the birth rituals in Aztec societies? Are women involved in them? How are they involved in them? So start looking for that type of evidence. So what am I wanting to write about? Then you should also ask yourself, where should I go to actually research this? Now, that's again a fairly open-ended question about where should I go, and I will provide you some resources. But as I mentioned in the course introduction, there are tons of digital archives these days. There are tons of digital access points. There's lots of secondary resources. We've got lots of libraries in the quote greater Houston area, which this college does fit into. It fits into the greater Houston area. So there's places like the Houston Municipal Library. There's a research center attached to that library. There are college libraries all across the area, not just Lone Star College, but Houston Community College libraries, the University of Houston Library, the Rice University Library, all sorts of places, St. Thomas is out there. You've got lots and lots of libraries that you can go to. And by virtue of being a student at Lone Star College, you also have digital access to various databases that will allow you to find information on the topic that you've chosen. So what am I going to write about? Where should I go to research this? And then what type of evidence am I going to be looking at? Now, I want to mention here, too, that don't look at your topic and think, well, there's already a lot written about that. So I'm not, that's probably not something I should write about. I want to disabuse you of that notion right now. Even if it's something that there, excuse me, even if there's something that there is a lot of source material out there, secondary sources, books that have been written about a topic, even if that's the case, that doesn't mean that you should shy away from that topic. I want to give you a stat that is irrelevant for anything other than this discussion, but I want you to know this. There have been more than 15,000 books written just about Abraham Lincoln, okay? Not the various aspects of Abraham Lincoln, but if we just said this book is about Abraham Lincoln, 15,000 books written about Abraham Lincoln. So if somebody says, well, there can't be something new written about Abraham Lincoln, well, that's first of all, that's not true. We can always find something that a historian can write about. So there's always something new. And we're at a stage in our research, you and I, us as a class, however you want to contextualize this to make it work for you. This class is, this is not a graduate research seminar. I'm not looking to get you to write, quote, new research or to come up with some sort of earth-shattering interpretation about something. You're just going to go out and do research. That's all it is. And then write up, this is what I found. Okay, so don't worry about it being some sort of new line. Don't think about it in terms of, I've got to find something, quote, new to write about. You don't have to. Okay, that's not what this class is about. So what am I wanting to write about? Where should I go to research it? And what type of evidence am I going to be looking at? Am I going to be looking at primary or secondary sources? Now, the short answer in all of this is that you should be looking at both. But I'm sure some of you might be thinking, well, I don't know. What's primary source material? What's secondary source material? Okay. So where should you go? Internet is, as I mentioned, a very good place to go. Your textbook is a great place to go. Not only does your textbook give you topics, not only does it have an index where it can tell you, these are some topics that you can think about in terms of Mexican American history, but your textbook should also have source notes in it, which will point you to other sources. So to use our example, what's the role of women in Aztec societies? Your textbook could probably tell you, the writer of the textbook could tell you, this is where I went to look for stuff about Aztec society. And you should be able to find something by doing that. There are all sorts of magazines and journals that you can look at. And that, again, by virtue of being a student at Lone Star College, you have digital access to literally hundreds of journals and magazines. So there's no shortage of places to look for material. And then, of course, there's something else. In addition to having all sorts of access to those libraries that I mentioned, you also have access to the librarians. Okay, and librarians are very important. I have never, ever, from the moment I started, quote, being a historian, never liked the phrase just a librarian. Librarians are the lifeblood of what we do. If you do not make friends with librarians, you're getting nowhere. Librarians will take extra steps for you. I had a librarian that I worked with at the William McKinley Library in Warren, Ohio. And when I called them up and said, this is the topic I'm writing on, it was when I was writing my master's thesis. They were the only archive that had one piece of material that I needed. And I called them up and I said, look, you guys are the only ones that have this piece. I absolutely need it. I'm dying to get my hands on it. There's no way I'm going to be able to get to Warren, Ohio to get to this material. Is there any way that you guys can help me? And the person who was the librarian that I spoke with said, if you promise when you write your master's thesis to send us a copy, I will photocopy these documents and I will send them to you. I will fax every single page to you right now. And so, I mean, to me, that was an easy one. I said, absolutely, I'll do that. But the point is that when you talk to librarians, they know where everything is. They know where it's hidden. They're the ones who will say, yes, I'll go the extra step for you, or no, you can go to hell. You can use the the finder and research aids and just come to me and I'll point you to the photocopy machines. But they are the lifeblood. So make sure that you talk to the librarians. Make sure you're nice to the librarians, but utilize their expertise. They're the ones who are putting the archives and the collections together. They know where everything is. Okay. Also, think about when it comes to those questions, what types of questions should I be asking myself? How do I narrow it down? Think about what the real thing that you're interested in actually is. Okay. If you want to know what role women play in Aztec societies, think about, why do I want to know about the role women play in Aztec societies? Am I interested in warrior culture? Am I interested in domestic issues? Am I interested in birthing rituals? Am I interested in how property is passed down? Ask yourself these types of questions so that you can narrow down, that you can hone in on one particular issue, so that you can say, after you're done getting to the actual heart of the matter, what am I going to attempt to demonstrate with this research? What am I going to try to actually write about? What am I attempting to demonstrate, and how do I do that? Okay. The answer, what you're trying to demonstrate, how you're going to demonstrate it, that is found in your evidence. Your evidence is going to provide the answers to those questions. And the two types of evidence are primary source evidence and secondary source evidence. A primary source, very simply, is a document or a physical object that was written or created during the time period studied. And there are a bunch of examples on the screen here about primary sources. When we're talking about history, we're really talking about things that are documents or written material. It's usually not objects. That's, we're not an anthropology or archaeology class, but sometimes I don't know, a Purple Heart that somebody got awarded, that's a primary source, okay, saying that this is, such and such as Purple Heart. But the types of things that you're going to be looking at are things like diaries or speeches, manuscripts, letters that people have written back and forth to one another. Historians absolutely rely on letters. The letters that people write are often, especially famous people, are often collected and donated to archives so that these things are around. Interviews, especially if we're talking about stuff, the closer we get to the modern era, interviews are critically important primary sources. News and film footage, these are also primary sources. So for example, if you were talking about, if you were in History 2328 and you wanted to know about Macario Garcia, then footage of him receiving his Congressional Medal of Honor, well, that would be a primary source, the newsreel footage of him receiving that. Autobiographies are a primary source. And as I mentioned, relics and artifacts are also primary sources, but we don't deal with those very often in history. So these are the primary sources. Okay, these are things that people were connected to. People actually wrote themselves or wrote in conjunction with something, or something that a person said that we actually have a record of. In American history, better examples in, quote, U.S. American history, we've got the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, Federalist Papers, every single autobiography of any president that you can think of, the speeches that they give, House resolutions, Senate resolutions. These are all things that are primary source materials. Okay, the letters between John Adams and his wife, Abigail Adams, the letters between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. Boy, I can't believe I had a brain lapse on that. Closer to Mexican American history, things like if you were talking about, wanting to know about the role of slavery in Mexico, and maybe saying, okay, I want to know about slavery in Mexico, and then I want to narrow it down to how committed to abolition were people in Mexico, was the government of Mexico, for example. A good primary source would be, or a good set of primary sources would be letters that the leaders of the Mexican Revolution wrote back and forth to each other, looking and seeing if they talked about slavery. The Mexican Constitution would be a great primary source. The Constitution of 1829, which we'll talk about when Santa Anna took over in Mexico. The Texas Constitution of 1836, when Texas seceded and declared independence from Mexico. These would all be very good primary sources because they are done by the people who were involved in these discussions. They were made by those people. They are directly connected to those people. So that's a primary source. Secondary sources. These are the other type of evidence. A secondary source is one that interprets and analyzes primary sources. Now, it also may be what's called a synthesis, meaning it does not analyze the primary sources at all. It just takes a look at what people have written about a topic, brings all of those things together and says, well, here's what I think based on what others have written. That's what's called a synthesis. So a secondary source may be the interpretation and analysis of primary sources. It may be an analysis of other secondary sources. It may have pictures. It may have graphics and quotes. It has access to other information that is primary. But for example, the book that you're reading this semester, The Other Slavery, that is a secondary source. Okay, the author of that book looked at a number of primary sources, looked at a number of secondary sources, and said, this is what I think about the institution of slavery, the enslavement of Native Americans. Okay, so textbooks are a secondary source. Magazine and journal articles are secondary sources. Histories of things. If somebody writes a history, like, a history of the slavery of Indians in the New World, that's a secondary source. Commentary on something. A person who says the founding fathers of the United States did all of this stuff. That commentary, that's secondary material. That's a secondary source. The point is that there's a point of removal from the primary. These are people who are not involved directly in the incident or in the writing of things. They didn't have anything to do with the creation of the Constitution or the abolition of slavery in Mexico or the abolition of slavery in the United States. These are people who are writing about what others did. Okay, so a secondary source moves away directly. They are one step removed from the primary. All right. Now, there are pros and cons of these particular types of evidence, the pros and cons of primary and secondary materials. So, and it's important to understand those. It's important to know these pros and cons. There are some advantages. Obviously, for primary sources, it's a firsthand account. So you know exactly what a person is saying about something. So if somebody says, well, they never said that, you can look at the document and go, well, yeah, they did. It's right here in black and white. They said it. They said, I believe this. Okay. They also give you a very good sense of the mood, about the emotion, about the sensibilities and senses that these people had about something. So there is some really good stuff with primary sources. Secondary sources also have advantages, and they have advantages. If I could spell, it would be spelled correctly on the screen here. But apparently, I guess I got a little to Key Happy as I was typing this out. They usually contain a number of primary source analyses. So the person who's reading it doesn't have to go out and read all of those primary sources. They know that the person who is writing it, at least in theory, is an expert on that topic. So they can go, well, okay, this person is an expert on this topic. They've analyzed this. They've looked at these things, and I can trust their analysis. Even if I disagree with it, I can trust that they read the documents. Okay. The researcher sees and often defines the bigger picture, looking at something and saying, this is important because they have a different view of what's going on. A lot of times, the people in the moment don't have that broader view, and that's listed kind of as a disadvantage too. I'll come back to that. But the researcher often sees the bigger picture, excuse me, and they often define that bigger picture. U.S. imperialism is important because, okay, so they've got the broader view of everything. Now, when it comes to disadvantages, primary source disadvantages is they are often, the people who are writing those documents are often, not always, but they are often incapable of seeing the events in a broader context. They're thinking solely about themselves, about what we are doing right now. How are we going to fix this problem in this moment? A really good example of that is the writing in, this is directly related to U.S. history, not Mexican-American history. But for U.S. history, a really good example is the writing of the Articles of Confederation. These were people who looked at the world around them and said, we have way too much authority emanating from the British government. So from a top-down authoritarian government, it tells us everything that we're allowed to do. So what we want to do is we want to fix that. We want to make sure we don't have that. So we're going to write our governing document, an Articles of Confederation, that eliminates that top-down authority. It puts all of that power, and it sends it out to multiple areas so nobody can really concentrate power. Sounds great in the moment because they are looking at the problem of a too authoritarian government. The problem is that they're not seeing the broader picture, that now as a new nation, they've got bigger problems and they have to come together to fix those bigger problems. But the type of government they've created doesn't allow for that. Okay. So they're only looking at it through this very narrow lens, if you will. Okay. So they're not able to see that broader picture. That is a huge disadvantage of primary sources. I'm going to add to this that there's a disadvantage to the primary source in that sometimes, especially if we're talking about interviews, if we're talking about oral histories, sometimes those people are too close to a situation and they're not even in their analysis. They don't look at something. They don't look at something and say, yeah, we could have done better on that sort of thing. They look at it and say, no, we were absolutely right. We did the right thing here. They are not critically analyzing themselves and what they have done. Now, a secondary source in terms of disadvantages, we've got the human factor. Okay, see, I'm pointing you to lecture 1, the introductory lecture, where I told you this idea about, history tells us that. History doesn't tell us anything. Historians tell us this stuff. Since it is human beings, the ones who are writing the history, since they're the ones doing the history and doing the analysis, it's subjective. It is always subjective. Secondary sources are always subjective in nature. And because it is subjective, it's open to interpretation. They are reflective of biases. Now, having a bias against or towards something is not necessarily a bad thing. It's when you claim to not have the bias and the bias absolutely shows that it becomes a problem. So there is a big disadvantage when it comes to secondary sources as well. So there's advantages and disadvantages, and you just kind of have to figure out how to traverse those advantages and disadvantages. Now, the next step in the historical method is the creation of a hypothesis, the creation of a hypothesis. You're going to go out, you're going to do your preliminary research, the stuff that you're going to, at minimum, submit to me in that second step in the semester project. But based on that preliminary research and the questions you have asked yourself, you're going to come up with a hypothesis. It's created based on what you believe has happened or how you have understood your research. Now, this is why a hypothesis is not a guess. Okay, so don't fall into that trap. A hypothesis is based on having done a little bit of research already. Okay, so a hypothesis is, the best way to think of it is, I believe that blank has happened, or I believe that this is true. And a good example is a person who's interested in trying to determine whether a map that they had found was used during the Revolutionary War. So hypothesis in that case, if I can prove that this map was from the 1770s, then it is possible it was used at Valley Forge by George Washington and the Continental Army. So that's a hypothesis. It's not, not the greatest, but it's a good hypothesis. If I can demonstrate, this is another one, if I can demonstrate that women exclusively controlled the birthing process in Aztec societies, to go back to my women in Aztec societies thing, if I can demonstrate that women exclusively controlled the birthing process in Aztec societies, then it is possible to argue that women had greater control over domestic issues than we previously believed. That is a hypothesis. Now, again, since this is not science, since we're not dealing with the scientific method, you can have your hypothesis and work through that hypothesis, and your conclusions, when you write up everything, can be perfectly valid if you go, I did all the research and the research doesn't point that way. The research doesn't suggest that. So that's okay. Okay, so coming up with well, I was wrong in my hypothesis, that's equally valid research. Now, when you are doing your work, you're going to, the next step in working with that hypothesis is you're going to research for evidence to support or reject the working hypothesis. Okay, you're going to research for evidence to support or reject the working hypothesis. One of the worst traps that historians fall into is what's called cherry picking their evidence, saying, all right, I believe the following to be true, or my hypothesis was that from the previous slide, if I can demonstrate that women exclusively controlled the birthing process, it might be possible to demonstrate that they had greater control over domestic affairs, whatever that was. If a historian starts looking for evidence and they find piece after piece after piece after piece that demonstrates the exact opposite, and they find maybe 2 pieces that support the hypothesis, a bad historian takes those 2 pieces and says, see, here's the proof, but ignores the other, say, 8 or 9 things that reject their hypothesis. That's what cherry picking is. It's cherry picking evidence. And it is a huge mistake. And especially when historians present their work. If they present to experts who really, really know the material, and they go, well, okay, you've got these 2 things that support your hypothesis, but I don't see anything about the 8 that reject your hypothesis, that's trouble. That's really, really bad. So you have to, when you're doing this work, you have to look for the evidence, excuse me, that supports and rejects. Okay, I've got support or reject, but you got to deal with the supporting and rejecting evidence. Okay, even if you get those 8 things that reject your hypothesis, that suggest you're wrong, you can stick to your guns and say, here's those 8 things, and here's why they're wrong. Here's why they don't matter, whatever. But you can't completely ignore the things that don't support your work. So as you research for the evidence to support and or reject your working hypothesis, continue studying the primary sources and the secondary sources, and continue to ask the questions. Is this document or is this source authentic? In the case of a document, is it real? Is it reliable? In the case of a secondary source, is it a pop history? Is it written by a conspiracy theorist? Or is it written by somebody who does not have the expertise in the field? For example, now, not being a historian does not necessarily mean just because they're not a historian, they don't have expertise. But for example, a really good example of this is there was a work done several years ago that was about history, that was on a historical topic from the 1850s in the United States. And it was written by a biologist. This person had no professional training as a historian, no advanced degrees, no university said this person, no university conferred degrees that suggest that this person is an expert in the field. So, whatever knowledge they have in biology, that's great, but that doesn't make them a great historian. So you have to ask yourself, is the stuff that I'm reading, are those secondary sources, are they reliable? Does it and you've got to continue to ask the question, does my piece of evidence, does it support my hypothesis? Does it corroborate? Or does it refute my hypothesis? If it refutes your hypothesis, if you get to a point in your writing where you go, look, I've got so much here that says my hypothesis is wrong, I can only conclude that my hypothesis is wrong, then you write that. That's what you write. Okay. But again, I told you that you can come to a point where you find enough reliable documents, or you believe that stuff is more reliable, that this document is more real, that this source is more reliable. And you can say, look, these other things, they refute my hypothesis, but here's why they're unacceptable. Here's why I don't trust them. Here's why I think I'm still correct. Okay. So that can be done, but you've got to keep in mind, corroborate or refute the hypothesis. So, formulating a thesis statement, that's going to be our next part. You have to come up with a very strong thesis statement, because a thesis statement, this is your argument. It's in one sentence. You're telling the reader what your argument is going to be. This is what I'm going to prove or demonstrate. I prefer demonstrate. This is what I'm going to demonstrate to you. So an example of a weak thesis. Abraham Lincoln was very important to American history. That's weak. Everybody knows that. Even people who don't like Abraham Lincoln. So for example, let's say a Southerner of the 1890s would definitely not have liked Abraham Lincoln. But they would still reject the idea that Abraham Lincoln was not important. That would be silly. So they understood that Lincoln was very important. So that's not a strong thesis. That's a weak thesis. A stronger thesis is something that argues something that, you maybe aren't arguing something new, but you're drilling down more than just this. Well, it's very important. A strong thesis, for example, about Abraham Lincoln's actions during the Civil War demonstrate that he was a much more capable military commander than previously understood. So it takes the notion that Abraham Lincoln had no idea what he was doing as a military commander and says, no, what my research demonstrates is Abraham Lincoln was a very capable military commander. Okay. So in one sentence, that's what that one sentence did. In one sentence, you're introducing your audience to the historical account that you're going to be writing about. You're saying, this is my argument. Now, your audience might look at that, your reading audience, in this case, it'd be me. Your audience might disagree. Your audience might go, oh, that's BS. Abraham Lincoln was terrible. Abraham Lincoln didn't know what he was doing as a military commander. Thank God he had generals in the Union Army. Okay. Now, the rest of your statement about what you're going to be doing in your first paragraph includes all of the reasons you're going to be using later in the essay. So your first sentence, this is my thesis statement. The rest of what's going to come in that paragraph is going to be, here are the ways I'm going to demonstrate this to you. This is what I think demonstrates that Abraham Lincoln was a much more capable military commander than we have previously thought. Each one of those reasons is going to be a paragraph in the body of your essay. Now, sometimes people use the thesis statement as the last statement, the last sentence of their introductory paragraph. That's fine. You can do it as the first sentence of your introductory paragraph. It can be the last sentence of your introductory paragraph. So you might do something like, say, throughout history, if you were talking about Abraham Lincoln, which you won't be because he's not important to Mexican American history like that. Abraham Lincoln was always thought to be a very weak military commander because he had no military experience. He didn't know this, he didn't know that, he didn't go to a military academy, blah, 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 blah. However, in researching this, I've discovered the following has become clear, or I have discovered, that Abraham Lincoln was a voracious reader. He was capable of understanding spatial relations in a way that historians didn't previously give him credit for. He read everything on military theory and tactics and strategy that he possibly could, and in some cases, effectively overruled his military commanders. As a consequence, I am going to argue, it is my thesis, that Abraham Lincoln was a much better commander than we previously understood. There you go. There's your first paragraph. Altogether, you've got your topic about what we're going to be talking about, the ways that we think, that you think that you're going to demonstrate this, and then here is what I am arguing. Now, again, you can make it the first paragraph if you want, but whether it's your first or last of your introductory paragraph, it is definitely going to be the first sentence of your conclusion. When you write your conclusion, you're going to say, remember, this is what I told you I argued. So think about it this way. Your introductory paragraph, this is what I'm going to do throughout the narrative of this essay, including your thesis statement. This is what I'm going to argue to you. And then your conclusion is, this is what I did. Okay, this is what I demonstrated to you. Now, at the end of the day, after I've read the paper, I can agree or disagree with you. I can say, well, you demonstrated 2 of these, but you didn't demonstrate the other 3, or you demonstrated 2, but you didn't demonstrate 1, or whatever. Okay, so I might agree, I might disagree, and the reader, your audience, might agree or disagree. But the point is, this is the structure. This is how you structure that paper. But the first part of this is getting a strong thesis statement. And then the last part is, once you've come up with your strong thesis statement, you put that thesis statement into the introductory paragraph, and then you write the narrative. And writing the narrative, there's no other way to do it. There's no secret. There's no magic bullet, as they say. You do the work, you do the research, and then you simply write what you discovered. Okay, using reliable, authentic, objective primary evidence, as well as the secondary evidence that you used. Okay, and that's going to be your semester project. Very simply, I'm going to roll all the way back to the front of all of this stuff. The historical method. I'm going to do your preliminary research. Okay. Hopefully that will result in a very good proposal that you can give to me. If you look in the syllabus and if you look online, you'll see the dates for the due dates for all of this. So you'll do the preliminary research and come up with your proposal. You'll create a hypothesis. This is what I think happened. You're going to gather the evidence. You're going to continue finding work in the primary sources and secondary sources to gather the evidence. You're going to come up with a thesis statement, and you're going to write the narrative. You're just going to write what you found. Now, as with everything else, I know that I say everything else, and there's really only been 2 lectures, but as with all of the other stuff that I've talked about so far, if you run into any roadblocks, do not hesitate to contact me. You've got access to me via email. You've got access to me via the D2L email. You've got, as I pointed out, I'm going to give you all my phone number. You'll have all sorts of access to me. Do not let this get away from you. If you run into any roadblocks whatsoever, even if it's, God, I don't even know what I want to do, get in touch with me and I will help you. Okay. I'm going to put this up in D2L. This is where we're going to stop for the historical method. I'm going to put this up in D2L so you can use it to refer to. And again, this is what's going to carry you through your semester project. So good luck and get to it.